The engine died with a shudder that seemed to echo through the empty highway, leaving Sarah Chen stranded 20 miles from anywhere that mattered. Steam hissed from under the hood of her grandfather's 1967 Ford pickup, the truck that had carried 3 generations of dreams and was now betraying her on the most important day of her career. She had exactly 47 minutes to reach the State Transportation Board meeting, where a multi-million-dollar contract hung in the balance. And her phone showed no signal bars in this forgotten stretch of rural Montana. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What she didn't know was that help would come from the last person she'd expect, someone whose own world had crumbled just months before, someone who understood what it meant to fight for everything you had left. Sometimes salvation arrives in work boots and oil-stained hands, carrying tools instead of promises, and sometimes the person who fixes your engine ends up mending something much deeper that you didn't even know was broken. The sun blazed mercilessly over Highway 89, turning the asphalt into a ribbon of heat that shimmered and danced in the Montana afternoon. Sarah Chen stood beside her grandfather's vintage Ford pickup, her tailored business suit already wilting under the relentless August sun. The truck's chrome bumper reflected the harsh light like a mirror, but the engine beneath the dented hood had gone completely silent after that final, ominous shudder. She checked her watch again. 43 minutes now. The Bozeman Regional Transportation Authority meeting would begin without her, and with it, her chance to present the bid that could save Chen Logistics from bankruptcy. 3 generations of her family's work, built from nothing by her grandfather who had driven this very truck to deliver supplies across the mountain passes, now hung by a thread thinner than the wisp of steam still rising from the radiator. Sarah popped the hood and stared at the engine with the helpless frustration of someone who had spent their life managing fleets of vehicles but had never actually learned to fix one. Oil dripped steadily onto the hot asphalt below, forming dark spots that reminded her of the red ink spreading across her company's balance sheets. Her grandfather would have known exactly what was wrong, could have had it running again with nothing but a wrench and stubborn determination. But Grandfather Chen had been gone for 2 years now, taking with him not just his mechanical genius, but the steady contracts that had kept the family business afloat. The highway stretched empty in both directions, a lonely strip of gray cutting through golden wheat fields that rolled toward distant mountains. No other vehicles had passed in the 20 minutes since the Ford had given up its ghost, and her cell phone remained stubbornly disconnected from any tower that might carry her. Desperate calls for help. The irony wasn't lost on her that the woman who ran a logistics company couldn't manage to get herself from point A to point B when it mattered most. Sarah kicked at a loose piece of gravel, sending it skittering across the asphalt. The sound echoed in the vast silence of the prairie, emphasizing just how alone she was. She had built Chen Logistics from the small trucking company her grandfather had started with this old Ford, expanding it into a regional transportation network that employed 47 people and moved everything from medical supplies to construction equipment across the Mountain West. But the big corporations had been squeezing smaller companies like hers for years, underbidding contracts and forcing independents out of business. This afternoon's presentation was supposed to change everything. The state had put out a bid for a 5-year contract to manage transportation logistics for rural healthcare facilities, a deal worth enough to not only save her company, but allow it to grow. Sarah had spent months preparing, calling in every favor, leveraging every relationship she had built over the past 15 years. The proposal sitting in her briefcase represented the most comprehensive transportation solution the region had ever seen, combining efficiency with the kind of personal service that only a local company could provide. But none of that mattered. If she couldn't get to Bozeman, the meeting would start at 3 o'clock sharp, and while she had insisted that punctuality was sacred in the transportation business, She was about to become a hypocrite stranded on a backwoods highway with a truck that had chosen the worst possible moment to remember its age. The heat was becoming unbearable. Sarah retreated to the meager shade cast by the truck's open hood, loosening her jacket and trying to calculate whether she could walk to the next town before dehydration became a serious concern. She had seen a road sign about 5 miles back, advertising Floyd's garage in a place called Millerville, but 5 miles in business heels under a Montana sun felt like an impossibly long journey. That's when she heard the rumble of an approaching engine, a deep, steady sound that grew stronger. As it came closer, Sarah stepped back onto the highway, shading her eyes against the glare as a battered pickup truck appeared in the distance, traveling north at a leisurely pace that suggested its driver was in no particular hurry to get anywhere. The truck slowed. As it approached, a faded blue Chevy that had seen better decades but moved with the confident rumble of an engine that was well maintained despite its age. Through the windshield, Sarah could make out the silhouette of a man wearing the baseball cap, and she felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Help was coming, but she was acutely aware of how vulnerable she was. A woman alone on a deserted highway in a business suit that marked her as clearly not from around here. The Chevy pulled over about 20 feet ahead of her truck, its engine ticking as it cooled. The driver's door opened with a creak of hinges that had absorbed years of mountain weather, and a man stepped out who looked like he had absorbed just as much. He was tall and lean, wearing faded jeans and a gray t-shirt that had been washed so many times it was soft as cotton flannel. Work boots that had seen serious use carried him across the asphalt with the easy gait of someone comfortable in his own skin. Sarah's first impression was of careful competence. The man moved with the deliberate precision of someone who thought before he acted, who measured twice and cut once. His face was weathered in the way that came from outdoor work, rather than outdoor recreation, lined around the eyes from squinting into sun and wind. Dark hair showed beneath a John Deere cap that was stained with honest sweat, and his hands, she noticed as he approached, were the hands of someone who fixed things for a living. "Looks like you're having some trouble," he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that could have been Montana-born or acquired through years of living here. He stopped a respectful distance away, not crowding her space, but close enough that she could see the genuine concern in his brown eyes. "I'm Tom Mitchell. You need some help?" Sarah felt herself relax slightly. There was something steady about this man, something that suggested he was exactly what he appeared to be, a mechanic who had stopped to help a stranded motorist. "Sarah Chun," she replied, extending her hand. His grip was firm but brief, calloused from years of working with tools. "And yes, I definitely need help. The engine just died about 20 minutes ago." Tom walked over to the Ford and leaned over the open hood, his trained eye taking in the engine compartment with the systematic approach of someone who had diagnosed thousands of mechanical problems. He didn't touch anything immediately, just looked and listened and observed. Sarah found herself studying his profile as he worked, noting the concentration lines between his eyebrows and the way his mouth pursed slightly when he was thinking. "Beautiful truck," he said after a moment, running his fingers along the chrome air cleaner with something approaching reverence. "67 F100, your grandfather take good care of her?" Sarah blinked in surprise. "How did you know it was?" "My grandfather's?" Tom glanced at her with a small smile. "Educated guess. Truck this old, maintained this well, still being driven by family. Usually means it was passed down from someone who knew how to take care of things." He leaned back over the engine. "Plus, there's a photo tucked under the sun visor of an older Asian gentleman standing next to this exact truck. Family resemblance is pretty strong." Despite her anxiety about the time, Sarah found herself impressed by his observation skills. "That's him. Chun Wei-ming. He started our transportation company with this truck back in 1967, the same year he bought it off the lot in Billings. "Must have been a hell of a man," Tom said, his tone respectful. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He reached into the engine compartment and gently probed a few connections, his movements economical and sure. "What kind of transportation company?" "Chen Logistics. We handle freight and supply delivery across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas." Sarah checked her watch again. 38 minutes. "Actually, I'm supposed to be in Bozeman right now for a meeting that could save the whole business." This truck decided to break down at exactly the wrong moment. Tom looked up from the engine, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. Understanding, maybe, or recognition of the kind of pressure that came with keeping a family business alive. "How long do you have?" 38 minutes to get to a state transportation board meeting. "It's probably impossible now, but I have to try." Tom nodded, his jaw tightening with what looked like determination. "Let me see what I can do." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, shining it into the darker recesses of the engine compartment. "Looks like you've got a blown radiator hose and probably a cracked thermostat housing. The oil leak is coming from a loose drain plug, nothing serious. But the cooling system failure is what killed the engine." Sarah felt her heart sink. "How long would that take to fix?" "Normally, a couple hours if I had to drive back to my shop for parts." Tom straightened up and looked at her directly. "But I've got a radiator hose in my truck that might fit, and I always carry a spare thermostat housing. If I'm lucky and everything goes right, maybe 20 minutes." "You carry spare parts in your truck?" Tom shrugged. "Occupational hazard. I run Mitchell's garage in Millerville, about 7 miles south of here. You learn to be prepared when you're the only mechanic for 30 miles in any direction." He was already walking back to his Chevy. "Besides, I've got a 6-year-old daughter who's counting on me to pick her up from soccer practice in an hour. I understand what it means when time matters." Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with gratitude. "I can pay you whatever you think is fair. If you can get this truck running, you'll be saving more than just my day." Tom had reached his truck and was pulling a toolbox from the bed. "Let's worry about getting you to your meeting first. We can sort out payment later." He paused and looked back at her. "You might want to call ahead and let them know you're running late. Even if I get this fixed fast, you're still looking at 25 minutes to Bozeman if you drive like hell." Sarah pulled out her phone and stared at the screen. "Still no signal, no coverage out here." Tom tossed her his phone without hesitation. "Try mine. Sometimes different carriers work better in different spots." His phone showed 3 bars. Sarah dialed the Transportation Authority office, her fingers trembling slightly as she waited for the connection. The receptionist answered on the 3rd ring, and Sarah quickly explained her situation, begging for just a 30-minute delay in the meeting. The woman on the other end was professional but not encouraging. The board members had busy schedules, and other companies were presenting as well. They would see what they could do, but couldn't make any promises. Sarah hung up and handed the phone back to Tom, who was already kneeling beside the Ford with his toolbox open. "They'll try to hold the meeting, but no guarantees." "Then we better work fast." Tom was threading a socket wrench into the engine compartment, his movements quick but careful. "Can you hand me that radiator hose? The red one, about 18 inches long." Sarah found the hose and passed it to him, then stood back to watch him work. Tom Mitchell was clearly a master of his craft. His hands moved with the confidence that came from 30 years of fixing engines, every motion purposeful and efficient. He removed the damaged hose with quick, sure twists of his wrench, then compared the replacement to make sure it was the right size. "Perfect fit," he said with satisfaction. "Your grandfather bought himself a good truck. Ford knew how to build them in '67. As Tom worked, Sarah found herself studying him more carefully. There was something about the way he moved, the way he spoke about her grandfather and the truck, that suggested a deeper appreciation for things that lasted. In a world where everything seemed designed to be thrown away and replaced, Tom Mitchell appeared to be a man who understood the value of maintenance, of keeping something good running for as long as possible. "You said you have a daughter?" Sarah asked, partly to distract herself from the relentless ticking of time, and partly because she was genuinely curious about this man who had stopped to help a stranger. Tom's hands paused for just a moment, and Sarah caught something that might have been pain flickering across his features. "Emma, she's 6, just started first grade this year." His voice carried the unmistakable warmth of a father talking about his child, but underneath, it was something else. Worry, maybe, or the weight of responsibility that came with raising a child alone. Soccer at 6 years old? That's impressive. "She's got more energy than a small nuclear reactor," Tom said, his smile returning as he went back to work on the hose connections. "And she's convinced she's going to play for the U.S. women's national team someday." I'm not about to argue with that kind of ambition. Sarah watched as he tightened the hose clamps with careful precision, checking and double-checking each connection to make sure it would hold. What about her mother? The question slipped out before Sarah could stop herself, and she immediately regretted asking something so personal. But Tom didn't seem offended, just focused on his work as he answered. "Karen died when Emma was 2, he said quietly. "Car accident on Highway 2 during the snowstorm. Emma doesn't remember much about her, which is probably both a blessing and a curse." Sarah felt a stab of sympathy. "I'm sorry. That must be incredibly difficult." Tom nodded, his attention apparently fixed on threading a new thermostat housing into place. "Some days are harder than others. But Emma's the best thing that ever happened to me, so we figure it out as we go." He looked up at Sarah briefly. "What about you? Family business means family, right?" "Just me now," Sarah said. "My parents retired to Arizona a few years ago. They wanted me to sell the company and do something safer, but this business is all I've ever known. Grandfather built it from nothing, and I can't bear the thought of letting it die on my watch." Tom was reaching for a wrench to tighten the thermostat housing. "Sounds like you inherited more than just a business. You inherited a responsibility." "Exactly. 47 people work for Chen Logistics. Their families depend on the jobs we provide. The contract I'm trying to get to Bozeman for could secure all of those jobs for the next 5 years. Tom paused in his work and looked at her directly. "That's a lot of weight to carry." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You have no idea. The trucking industry is brutal right now. The big corporations are underbidding everyone, forcing smaller companies out of business so they can monopolize the market. We've been hanging on by our fingernails for the past 2 years, but you're still fighting. What choice do I have? This company is my grandfather's legacy. It's the livelihood of 47 families. It's everything I've worked for since I was 18 years old." Sarah could hear the desperation creeping into her voice and tried to rein it in. "Sorry, I don't usually dump my problems on strangers." Tom had moved on to checking the oil level, pulling the dipstick and examining it in the sunlight. "We're not strangers anymore. I'm the guy fixing your truck so you can save your family business. That makes us partners in this particular crisis." There was something reassuring about the way he said it, as if fixing her truck and helping her get to Bozeman was now his mission as much as hers. Sarah watched as he added a small amount of oil from a bottle he had retrieved from his truck, his movements still quick but thorough. "Oil level's good now," he said, replacing the dipstick. "The leak was just a loose drain plug. Tightened it up and you should be fine." He walked around to the driver's side. "Now let's see if she start." Sarah held her breath as Tom turned the key. The engine cranked once, twice, then caught with a rumble that sounded like music. The temperature gauge showed normal, and there were no warning lights on the dashboard. Steam had stopped rising from under the hood, and the engine settled into the steady idle that she remembered from countless rides with her grandfather. "You did it," Sarah said, hardly believing it. She could have hugged this man who had appeared out of nowhere and worked a mechanical miracle in less than 20 minutes. Tom climbed out of the cab and closed the hood, wiping his hands on a rag from his back pocket. "She should get you to Bozeman just fine, but you'll want to keep an eye on the temperature gauge, just in case. And get those hoses replaced properly when you have time." Sarah was already calculating drive time and traffic patterns. 23 minutes if I push it and catch the lights right. I might actually make it. "You'll make it," Tom said with quiet confidence. "Drive safe, but don't be afraid to use that old Ford's power when you need it. Your grandfather built this truck to work, not to sit in traffic." Sarah reached for her purse, but Tom was already shaking his head. "I told you, we'll worry about payment later. Right now you need to get to that meeting. I can't just drive away without paying you for parts and labor." Tom smiled, and for the first time since he had stopped to help, Sarah saw him truly relax. "Tell you what, if you get that contract, bring the truck by my shop sometime. I'd like to hear how the story ends. And maybe you can tell me more about your grandfather and this business he built." Sarah felt something unexpected stirring in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the Montana sun. "I'll do that. Mitchell's garage in Millerville? Main Street, right across from the post office. Can't miss it." Tom was already walking back to his truck. "Now get going. Those government types don't like to be kept waiting." Sarah climbed into the Ford, her hands shaking slightly as she fastened her seatbelt. Through the windshield, she could see Tom standing beside his Chevy, watching to make sure her truck was running properly. She rolled down her window and called out, "Thank you, Tom Mitchell. I owe you more than you know." Tom touched the brim of his cap in a gesture that belonged to an earlier, more courteous time. "Just get that contract, Sarah Chun. Make your grandfather proud." As Sarah pulled back onto Highway 89, pressing the accelerator with more confidence than she had felt in months, she glanced in her rearview mirror to see Tom's blue Chevy following at a distance. He was making sure she got safely on her way before heading back to collect his daughter from soccer practice. The gesture was small but profound, the kind of consideration that spoke to character rather than mere politeness. The Ford's engine hummed with renewed strength as Sarah pushed the speedometer toward the upper limits of what was safe on the two-lane highway. The temperature gauge held steady and the oil pressure remained solid. Whatever Tom had done, he had done it right. She thought about his hands as he worked, efficient and sure, and the way he had spoken about her grandfather with genuine respect for a man he had never met. Sarah reached for the radio and found a classic country station that seemed appropriate for the moment. As Merle Haggard sang about working man blues, she pressed the accelerator a little harder and watched the Montana landscape blur past the windows. Wheat fields gave way to rangeland, and the distant mountains grew larger and more defined as she headed north toward Bozeman and the meeting that would determine everything. But even as she focused on the road ahead and the presentation she would need to deliver, part of her mind kept drifting back to the man who had stopped to help a stranger. Tom Mitchell, who carried spare parts in his truck and worked with the quiet competence of someone who understood that fixing things properly was always worth the extra effort. Who spoke about his daughter with unmistakable love and about responsibility. With the gravity of someone who had learned its weight the hard way. She had offered to pay him, but he had refused. He had asked for nothing in return except the hope that she would succeed in her mission. In a world where everyone seemed to have an angle, where every favor came with a price tag attached, Tom Mitchell had simply fixed her truck and wished her well. The gesture felt almost antiquated, like something from the era when her grandfather had started his business with nothing but determination and the willingness to treat people fairly. As the outskirts of Bozeman appeared on the horizon, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the tide was finally turning. The truck was running, she was going to make the meeting, and somewhere behind her was a man who had proved that decent people still existed in the world. Whether or not she got the contract, the day had already given her something valuable. The reminder that sometimes help came from unexpected places, and that kindness still existed among strangers. The State Transportation Building loomed ahead, a modern structure of glass and steel that represented everything Sarah's grandfather's generation had worked to build. As she pulled into the parking lot with 3 minutes to spare, Sarah whispered a quick prayer to whatever spirits watched over old trucks and desperate women, then gathered her briefcase and headed for the doors that would open onto the future of Chen Logistics. The conference room at the Montana State Transportation Authority buzzed with the low murmur of voices and the shuffle of papers as Sarah Chen hurried through the glass doors with 30 seconds to spare. Her heart was still racing from the drive, and she could feel a thin sheen of perspiration on her forehead, despite the building's aggressive air conditioning. The Ford had performed flawlessly during the 23-minute sprint from Highway 89, running as smoothly as if it had just rolled off the assembly line instead of breaking down in the middle of nowhere 45 minutes earlier. Sarah smoothed her jacket and took a deep breath as she approached the reception desk, where a middle-aged woman with steel gray hair looked up with the expression of someone who had been expecting her to arrive either very late or not at all. The nameplate on her desk read Margaret Kowalski, Executive Assistant, and her smile was polite but strained. "Miss Chun, I presume? You made excellent time considering your circumstances. The board is just finishing up with the previous presenter." Margaret gestured toward a row of chairs along the wall where several other people sat with their own briefcases and nervous expressions. "You're scheduled for 3:30, which gives you about 5 minutes to collect yourself." Sarah nodded and took a seat, using the time to review her presentation notes one final time. Around her, representatives from 3 other transportation companies waited for their turns to pitch for the same contract. She recognized 2 of them: Davidson Freight, a regional company based out of Billings that had been steadily expanding across the Mountain West, and Western Transport Solutions, which was actually a subsidiary of a massive logistics corporation based in Denver. The third company was unfamiliar to her, but the woman representing them wore an expensive suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone backed by serious money. Sarah looked down at her own presentation materials, suddenly aware of how modest her proposal must appear compared to what these larger companies could offer. Chen Logistics might have 47 employees and a solid reputation for reliability, but they were still fundamentally a family business operating out of a converted warehouse in Billings. Her competitors had corporate backing, economies of scale, and the kind of resources that allowed them to underbid contracts and absorb losses that would destroy a smaller company. But Sarah also knew something her competitors didn't: the unique challenges of transportation logistics in rural Montana. Her grandfather had spent 50 years learning every back road, every weather pattern, every seasonal obstacle that could affect delivery schedules across the region. That knowledge had been passed down to Sarah and was embedded in every route plan, every contingency protocol, every relationship with local suppliers and customers that Chen Logistics had built over half a century. The conference room door opened, and a man in an expensive navy suit emerged, followed by 2 assistants carrying presentation materials. Margaret consulted her schedule and called out, "Chen Logistics, you're up." Sarah gathered her briefcase and portfolio, straightened her shoulders, and walked into the conference room with the confidence of a woman who had just watched a stranger fix her grandfather's truck with nothing but spare parts and determination. If Tom Mitchell could solve an impossible mechanical problem in 20 minutes on the side of a highway, she could convince 5 government bureaucrats that Chen Logistics was the right choice for this contract. The conference room was larger than she had expected, with a polished oak table that could seat 20 people and windows that looked out over the Gallatin Valley toward the Bridger Mountains. 5 members of the transportation board sat along. One side of the table, their expressions ranging from politely interested to openly skeptical. Sarah recognized the chairman, Robert Hastings, from newspaper photos. He was a former state legislator who had built his political career on fiscal responsibility and government efficiency. Ms. Chen, welcome. Please take a seat and tell us about Chen Logistics. Hastings gestured to a chair across from the board members, and Sarah settled herself with the practiced ease of someone who had been presenting to potential clients for 15 years. Thank you for accommodating my schedule and difficulties this afternoon. I know your time is valuable, so I'll get straight to the point. Sarah opened her portfolio and withdrew a bound presentation that represented months of research and preparation. Chen Logistics has been providing transportation services across Montana for 56 years. We've never missed a contracted delivery deadline, never had a safety violation, and never filed for bankruptcy protection or restructuring. She could see that last point register with the board members. In an industry where companies folded regularly and contracts were often disrupted by corporate mergers and acquisitions, stability was worth more than low bid prices. That's an impressive track record, said Dr. Patricia Reeves, the board member who oversaw rural healthcare initiatives. But this contract involves some very specific logistical challenges. We're talking about delivering medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, and equipment to hospitals and clinics in some of the most remote areas of the state. Weather delays aren't just inconvenient, they can be life-threatening. Sarah had been waiting for this question. Dr. Reeves, Chen Logistics has been handling medical deliveries to rural facilities for over 20 years. We maintain relationships with local airports, volunteer pilots, and emergency services coordinators in every county we serve. When Highway 200 was closed for 6 days last winter due to avalanche danger, we got insulin to the clinic in Lincoln by coordinating with a Pyokat bush pilot who landed on a frozen lake. She could see the board members exchanging glances. That story had never made it into any newspaper, but it was exactly the kind of problem-solving that separated a local company from a corporate logistics provider. What about cost efficiency? Asked James Morrison, the board's financial officer. The other proposals we've seen today offer significant savings through economies of scale and automated routing systems. Sarah nodded. I'm sure they do. But I'd like you to consider the hidden costs of working with a company that doesn't understand this region. She opened her laptop and projected a map of Montana onto the screen at the front of the room. Let me show you what I mean. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah walked the board through a detailed analysis of rural transportation, challenges that she had been learning about since she was old enough to ride along in her grandfather's truck. She explained how automated routing systems failed to account for seasonal road conditions, how centralized dispatch centers couldn't adapt quickly to local emergencies, and how the relationships Chen Logistics had built with small-town suppliers and emergency services providers gave them capabilities that no amount of corporate efficiency could replicate. The Havre Medical Center called us at 2 in the morning last February, Sarah continued, because they had a premature baby who needed to be transferred to Billings, but a blizzard had shut down the interstate and the helicopter couldn't fly. We had a driver who knew the back roads between Chester and Great Falls, and we got that baby to the NICU 4 hours faster than the state emergency services could have managed. Dr. Reeves leaned forward. How do you scale that kind of local knowledge across a statewide contract? The same way we've been doing it for 56 years. We hire local drivers who know their regions, we maintain relationships with community partners, and we never promise what we can't deliver. Sarah clicked to her final slide, which showed not cost projections or efficiency metrics, but photographs. Pictures of Chen Logistics drivers helping elderly patients carry oxygen tanks, delivering supplies to a clinic during a power outage, and working with volunteer firefighters to evacuate medical equipment during a wildfire. This isn't just about transportation, Sarah said. "It's about being part of the communities we serve. When you hire Chen Logistics, you're not just getting a delivery service. You're getting partners who understand that in rural Montana, logistics isn't just business, it's survival." The room was quiet for a moment as the board members absorbed her presentation. Sarah could feel her heart beating as she waited for their response, knowing that everything her grandfather had built, everything her family had worked for, hung on the next few minutes. Chairman Hastings was the first to speak. "Ms. Chen, your presentation has been very compelling. But I have to ask about financial stability. The other companies we've heard from today have significant corporate backing. How do we know that Chen Logistics will still be in business in 5 years?" It was the question Sarah had been dreading, but also the one she had prepared for most carefully. "Mr. Hastings, I won't pretend that Chen Logistics has the deep pockets of a multinational corporation. But I would argue that our independence is actually a strength, not a weakness." She stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the valley. "My grandfather started this company with one truck and a promise to deliver what people needed, when they needed it. He kept that promise through recessions, oil crises, deregulation, and every other challenge the transportation industry has faced over the past 5 decades. We've survived because we adapt, because we serve our customers instead of shareholders, and because we never forgot that our reputation is worth more than any quarterly profit report." Sarah turned back to face the board. "The big companies that underbid us today will be here as long as this contract is profitable. The moment it stops generating the margins their corporate offices demand, they'll cut service, raise prices, or pull out of the market entirely. Chen Logistics will be here because this isn't just a contract for us. It's our home." Dr. Reeves nodded slowly. "What about succession planning? You're running a family business, but what happens if something happens to you?" "That's a fair question," Sarah acknowledged. "I have detailed succession plans in place, including cross-training programs for key personnel and partnerships with other regional companies that could step in if needed. But more importantly, Chen Logistics isn't dependent on any one person anymore. We have department heads who've been with the company for decades, drivers who know their routes better than their own neighborhoods, and relationships that span generations." The questions continued for another 15 minutes, covering everything from insurance coverage to environmental compliance to technology integration. Sarah answered each one with the confidence of someone who had spent her entire adult life preparing for this moment. But she could tell the board was struggling with the fundamental tension between cost savings and service quality. Finally, Chairman Hastings closed his folder and looked directly at Sarah. "Ms. Chen, we appreciate you taking the time to present to us today, especially given your transportation difficulties. We'll be making our decision within the next week, and all the companies will be notified simultaneously." Sarah gathered her materials and shook hands with each board member, trying to read their expressions for any hint of how her presentation had been received. Dr. Reeves held her handshake a moment longer than necessary and said quietly, "That story about the premature baby, that really happened." Every word. "The driver's name was Marcus Williams, and he's been with us for 12 years. The baby's name was Jessica, and she just started kindergarten this fall." Dr. Reeves smiled for the first time since Sarah had entered the room. "Thank you for reminding us what this is really about." As Sarah walked back through the lobby and out into the late afternoon sunshine, she felt a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and cautious optimism. She had done everything she could do, presented the best case possible for Chen Logistics, and now all that remained was waiting. The Ford sat in the parking lot exactly where she had left it, looking somehow smaller and more ordinary than it had during the desperate drive from Highway 89. Sarah climbed into the cab and sat for a moment in the silence, letting the events of the afternoon sink in. 3 hours ago, she had been stranded on a deserted highway with a broken-down truck, and no hope of making the most important meeting of her career. Now she had delivered what might have been the best presentation of her life, and it was all because a stranger named Tom Mitchell had stopped to help. She thought about his hands working under the hood, the quiet confidence with which he had diagnosed and fixed the problem, and the way he had refused payment because he understood that some things were more important than money. Tom had talked about his daughter Emma with obvious love, and about responsibility with the gravity of someone who had learned to carry it alone. There had been something in his manner, something in the careful way he spoke about fixing things and keeping them running, that suggested he understood the weight of preserving something valuable. Sarah started the engine, which turned over immediately and settled into the same steady idle that Tom had coaxed from it beside the highway. She had promised to bring the truck to his shop if she got the contract, but suddenly she realized she wanted to see him again, regardless of how the board's decision went. There was something about Tom Mitchell that intrigued her, something that went beyond gratitude for his mechanical expertise. The drive back toward Billings took her through the same landscape she had raced across earlier, but now she had time to appreciate the late afternoon light painting the wheat fields gold and casting long shadows from the mountains. She passed the spot where the Ford had broken down, marked now only by a small dark stain on the asphalt where oil had dripped from the engine. If Tom hadn't come along when he did, she would probably still be sitting there, watching her company's future disappear with the setting sun. As she reached the turnoff for Millerville, Sarah found herself slowing down. Tom's shop was supposed to be on Main Street, across from the post office. She had time before Emma's soccer practice would be over, and there was something she wanted to say that hadn't fit into their brief roadside conversation. Millerville was the kind of small Montana town that existed primarily because it had been there for 100 years and no one had gotten around to moving it. Main Street consisted of a post office, a general store, a cafe that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, and Mitchell's garage. The shop was exactly what Sarah had expected. A squat concrete building with 2 service bays, a small office area, and a hand-painted sign that had been touched up many times but never completely replaced. Tom's blue Chevy was parked beside the building, along with 2 other vehicles that were presumably waiting for repair. Sarah pulled the Ford up to the office entrance and sat for a moment, suddenly uncertain about what she was doing. She had driven 20 miles out of her way to thank a man who had already said payment wasn't necessary, but the truth was more complicated than simple gratitude. The office door was propped open to catch the evening breeze, and Sarah could hear the sound of tools and quiet country music from inside the shop. She walked through the door into a small waiting area that managed to be both functional and welcoming. The walls were covered with photographs of classic cars and trucks, certificates from various automotive organizations, and a framed picture of a little girl with Tom's eyes and a gap-toothed grin. "Be right with you," Tom's voice called from the service bay. "Just finishing up here." Sarah examined the photographs while she waited, noting the obvious pride Tom took in his work. There were before and after shots of restoration projects, pictures of him with satisfied customers, and several images of vintage vehicles at what looked like local car shows. One photograph showed Tom and a woman who must have been his wife, standing beside a beautifully restored 1969 Camaro. The woman was laughing at something off camera, and Tom was looking at her with an expression of complete adoration. "Sarah?" Tom emerged from the service bay, wiping his hands on a shop rag, his expression surprised but pleased. "How did the meeting go?" "Better than I had any right to hope for," Sarah said. "Thanks to you, I made it with time to spare and gave what might have been the best presentation of my career." Tom smiled, the kind of genuine pleasure that came from seeing someone succeed after helping them through a crisis. "That's fantastic. When will you know if you got the contract?" "Within a week. But regardless of how it turns out, I wanted to come by and properly thank you. You saved more than just my day, Tom. You might have saved my entire company. Tom shook his head. You saved your own company. I just fixed a radiator hose. You did a lot more than that. Sarah looked around the shop, taking in the organized tool benches, the clean work areas, and the obvious pride Tom took in maintaining his equipment. This is a beautiful shop. How long have you been here? About 8 years. I worked for other people for a while after I got out of the army, but I always wanted to have my own place. Tom gestured toward the service bays. It's not much, but it's mine, and it keeps Emma and me fed and housed. Sarah noticed the army reference but didn't want to pry. What kind of work do you specialize in? Little bit of everything. General automotive repair, some restoration work when people can afford it. Mostly I just try to keep the vehicles in this area running long enough for folks to get where they need to go. Tom paused, studying her face. You didn't drive all the way out here just to say thank you, did you? Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Actually, I did. But you're right that there's more to it. She looked at the photograph of Tom and his wife again. You talked about responsibility earlier, about keeping things running that matter to people. I think you understand something that most people don't, which is that some things are worth preserving, even when it would be easier to just start over with something new. Sarah gestured toward the vintage truck photographs on the wall. You restore old vehicles because they were built to last, because they represent something valuable that shouldn't be lost. I'm trying to save my family's business for the same reason. Tom was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Your grandfather's truck, the way you talk about the company he built, it matters to you in a way that goes beyond money. Exactly. And today, when you stopped to help me, you didn't just see a broken down vehicle and a woman in a business suit. You saw something worth fixing. Tom looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. I saw someone who needed help. That's all. No, it was more than that. You could have driven past, called highway patrol, told me to contact AA. Instead, you stopped and worked until you got it right. Sarah took a step closer. That tells me something about who you are. The sound of a vehicle pulling up outside interrupted the conversation. Through the window, Sarah could see a soccer mom's SUV with Emma Mitchell bouncing excitedly in the back seat. Tom glanced at his watch and smiled. Soccer practice is over. Emma's going to want to tell me about every goal, every save, and every injustice committed by the referee. He walked toward the door, then turned back. Would you like to meet her? She's usually curious about anyone driving a classic truck. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness that surprised her. Meeting Tom's daughter felt like crossing some kind of threshold, moving beyond the realm of grateful customer and helpful mechanic into something more personal. But she found herself nodding. I'd like that. Emma Mitchell burst through the door like a small hurricane, her dark hair escaping from a ponytail and her soccer uniform bearing evidence of serious play. She hugged her father around the waist, with the unconscious affection of a child who knew she was absolutely loved, then turned her attention to Sarah with bright, curious eyes. Dad, whose truck is that? It's really old, but it's awesome. Tom ruffled his daughter's hair. Emma, this is Miss Chen. That's her grandfather's truck, and it's from 1967. Emma's eyes widened. 1967? That's like older than you, Dad. Sarah laughed. It's older than me, too. My grandfather bought it brand new, and he taught me how to drive in that truck. Can I see inside? Emma asked, already heading for the door. Sarah looked at Tom, who shrugged with the resignation of a parent whose child had never met a stranger. She's been obsessed with vehicles since she could walk. I think it's genetic. Outside, Emma walked around the Ford with the serious attention of a professional appraiser, asking questions about the engine, the transmission, and whether Sarah had ever driven it really fast. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Sarah found herself telling stories about riding with her grandfather, about learning to shift gears and parallel park in a truck that was longer than most modern SUVs. "My dad can fix anything," Emma announced, with absolute confidence. "He fixed Mrs. Peterson's car when it wouldn't start, and he made Mr. Garcia's truck run better than when it was new." "Your dad fixed my truck too," Sarah said. "I was stuck on the highway, and he made it run perfectly." Emma looked between Sarah and Tom with the calculating expression of a 6-year-old who sensed undercurrents she didn't quite understand. "Are you going to come back and visit us?" Sarah felt that flutter of nervousness again. "I hope so. Your dad said he'd like to hear how my story ends." "What story?" Tom stepped in smoothly. "Ms. Chen was trying to get to an important business meeting today when her truck broke down. We helped her get there on time." Emma nodded solemnly. "Dad always helps people. Mom used to say that's because he has a good heart." The comment hung in the air for a moment, carrying weight that went beyond a child's simple observation. Sarah saw something shift in Tom's expression, a flicker of old pain quickly controlled, but not quite hidden. "Your mom sounds like she was a very smart woman," Sarah said gently. "She was," Emma replied matter-of-factly. "I don't remember her much, but Dad has lots of pictures, and he tells me stories. She would have liked your truck." Tom cleared his throat. "Emma, why don't you go wash up while I finish talking with Miss Chen? We need to get home for dinner." Emma hugged Sarah unexpectedly, a quick squeeze that felt like acceptance from someone whose approval clearly mattered to Tom. "I hope you get your contract," she said seriously. "And I hope you come back to visit." As Emma headed into the shop to use the bathroom, Tom and Sarah stood beside the Ford in the gathering dusk. The silence between them was comfortable, but charged with possibility. "She's wonderful," Sarah said. "You're doing an amazing job with her." "Some days I feel like I'm just making it up as I go along," Tom admitted. "But she's resilient. Kids adapt better than adults do to losing someone they love." Sarah wanted to ask about his wife, about how he had managed to rebuild his life around raising a daughter alone, but she sensed that was territory he wasn't ready to explore with someone he had met only a few hours earlier. "The offer stands," she said instead. "When I find out about the contract, I'll come back and tell you how the story ends. And maybe you can tell me more about this shop, about the work you do." Tom smiled, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the man he might have been before loss had taught him to be cautious with his trust. "I'd like that. Just remember, even if you don't get this contract, it doesn't mean the story is over. Sometimes it just means you're ready for the next chapter." As Sarah drove back toward Billings, Emma's words echoed in her mind. "Dad always helps people because he has a good heart." It was the kind of simple truth that children specialized in, cutting through complexity to reach the essential nature of things. Tom Mitchell helped people because helping was part of who he was, not because he expected anything in return. The highway was nearly empty as darkness settled over the prairie, and Sarah found herself thinking about the photographs in Tom's shop. The pictures of restored vehicles, satisfied customers, and the woman who had clearly been the love of his life. There was a story there, a history of building something worthwhile, and then having to continue without the person who had made it meaningful. Sarah understood that kind of loss, though hers had been different. When her grandfather died, she had lost not just a beloved family member, but a mentor, a business partner, and the living link to everything Chen Logistics represented. The weight of preserving his legacy had nearly crushed her at times, but it had also given her purpose when purpose was the only thing standing between survival and surrender. Maybe that was what she had recognized in Tom Mitchell, the understanding. That came from carrying responsibility for something larger than yourself. He was preserving more than just old vehicles in his shop. He was maintaining connections, solving problems, and keeping the small community of Millerville and functional. Just as she was trying to preserve not just a business, but the jobs and relationships and sense of identity that Chen Logistics represented for everyone who depended on it. The lights of Billings appeared on the horizon, marking the end of a day that had started with crisis and ended with possibility. Sarah had no idea whether the transportation board would choose Chen Logistics for the contract, but she knew that regardless of their decision, something important had changed. She had been reminded that good people still existed in the world, that help could come from unexpected places, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections were forged in moments of need. As she turned into the parking lot of her apartment complex, Sarah made a decision. Win or lose, she was going back to Millerville. There was more to learn about Tom Mitchell, more to understand about the man who carried spare parts in his truck and fixed problems with quiet competence. Emma had asked if she was going to come back and visit, and Sarah realized she very much wanted the answer to be yes. The call came at 7:43 on a Thursday morning, 6 days after Sarah's presentation to the transportation board. She was sitting in her office at Chen Logistics, watching the sunrise paint the building's skyline in shades of amber and rose, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. For a moment, she hesitated to answer, knowing that this could be the call that would determine everything. Sarah Chen speaking. Miss Chen, this is Margaret Kowalski from the Montana State Transportation Authority. Chairman Hastings would like to speak with you regarding your proposal. Are you available for a conference call this morning? Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to read the tone in Margaret's voice. Professional courtesy could mask either good news or bad, and there was no hint in the assistant's carefully neutral words about which direction this conversation would take. Of course, what time would be convenient? 8:15, if that works for you. The chairman will call your direct line. Sarah spent the next 32 minutes pacing her office, reviewing every moment of her presentation, every question the board had asked, every nuance of their expressions that she might have misread. Through her window, she could see the Chen Logistics yard where drivers were beginning their morning routines, checking their vehicles and reviewing their route assignments. 47 people whose livelihoods depended on what Chairman Hastings was about to tell her. At exactly 8:15, her phone rang. Miss Chen, thank you for making yourself available on short notice. Robert Hastings' voice carried the measured tone of someone who had delivered both good news and bad news many times in his political career. I'm calling to inform you that the board has reached a decision regarding the rural healthcare transportation contract. Sarah closed her eyes and gripped the phone tighter. I'm listening. The board has voted to award the contract to Chen Logistics. Congratulations, Miss Chen. Your proposal was exactly what we were looking for. For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. The words seemed to bounce around inside her head without quite connecting to their meaning. Chen Logistics had won. They had actually won. Ms. Chen? Are you there? Yes, I'm here. I'm just... Thank you, Mr. Hastings. Thank you so much. The deciding factor was your presentation on local knowledge and community relationships, Hastings continued. Dr. Reeves in particular was impressed by your examples of problem-solving in crisis situations. The board felt that Chen Logistics offered something the larger companies couldn't match: genuine understanding of what it means to serve rural communities. Sarah sank into her chair, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude and the sudden weight of responsibility that came with success. When would the contract begin? October 1st, which gives you about 6 weeks to prepare. The contract administrator will be in touch within the next few days to discuss implementation details. But Ms. Chen, I want you to know that this decision wasn't just about your proposal. It was about your company's reputation. We called some of your existing clients, and the feedback was unanimous. Chen Logistics doesn't just deliver goods, you deliver peace of mind. After Hastings hung up, Sarah sat in her office for several minutes, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. 5 years of guaranteed revenue. Job security for everyone who worked for Chen Logistics. The validation that her grandfather's approach to business built on relationships and reliability rather than corporate efficiency, still had value in the modern world. She thought immediately of Tom Mitchell, of his quiet confidence as he fixed the Ford's engine while time ticked away. Without his help, she would never have made it to the presentation. Without the presentation, Chen Logistics would have continued its slow slide toward bankruptcy. The chain of causation was clear. Tom had saved more than her truck that day. He had saved her company. Sarah picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Mitchell's garage. Tom answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the focused tone of someone who had been absorbed in detailed work. Mitchell's garage, Tom speaking. Tom, it's Sarah Chen. I wanted you to be among the first to know. We got the contract. There was a pause, and when Tom spoke again, Sarah could hear the genuine pleasure in his voice. Sarah, that's fantastic news. Congratulations. You must be over the moon. I wanted to thank you again. None of this would have happened without your help. You earned this yourself, Tom said firmly. I just fixed a radiator hose. You did much more than that, and you know it. Sarah paused, then made a decision. I was wondering if you and Emma would like to have dinner with me this weekend. I promised I'd come back and tell you how the story ended, and I think this calls for a celebration. Tom was quiet for a moment, and Sarah wondered if she had overstepped, if the invitation was too personal for whatever kind of relationship they had established. I'd like that, Tom said finally. Emma would too. She's been asking when the truck lady was coming back. The truck lady? That's what she calls you. Emma has her own way of categorizing people. Sarah laughed. I can think of worse nicknames. Would Saturday evening work? I could drive out to Millerville. Maybe we could have dinner at that cafe I saw on Main Street. Betty's place. It's not fancy, but the food is good, and Emma loves their milkshakes. Tom paused again. Are you sure you want to drive all the way out here? Billings has better restaurants. I want to see Millerville properly. Besides, I have a feeling Betty's place has something the fancy restaurants don't. Which is character, Sarah said. The same thing that drew me to a mechanic who carries spare parts in his truck and fixes strangers' problems without asking for payment. That Saturday evening, Sarah found herself more nervous than she had been before the transportation board presentation. She had changed clothes 3 times, settling finally on jeans and a soft blue sweater that struck what she hoped was the right balance between casual and thoughtful. The drive to Millerville gave her time to think about what this dinner meant, whether it was simply a celebration between new friends or something that carried the potential for deeper connection. Betty's place turned out to be exactly what Sarah had expected, a small-town cafe with vinyl booths, checkered linoleum floors, and the kind of home-style cooking that drew customers from 3 counties. Emma was waiting for her in the parking lot, bouncing on her toes with excitement and wearing a dress that she had clearly chosen herself, judging by the combination of polka dots and stripes. Sarah, Dad said you got your contract and now your company is saved. Sarah hugged the little girl, touched by her genuine enthusiasm. That's right. Thanks to your dad, everything worked out perfectly. Tom emerged from the cafe, and Sarah felt that flutter of attraction that had surprised her the first time they met. He was wearing khakis and a button-down shirt instead of his usual work clothes, and the effort he had made for their dinner together didn't go unnoticed. You clean up pretty well for a mechanic, Sarah said teasingly. You're not the first person to tell me I look better with less motor oil on my hands, Tom replied. Emma insisted we both dress up for your celebration dinner. Inside Betty's place, they settled into a corner booth while Emma chattered about soccer practice first grade and her plans to convince her father to get a dog. The cafe was busy with the Saturday evening crowd, and Sarah noticed how many people stopped by their table to say hello to Tom and Emma. It was clear that they were woven into the fabric of this small community in a way that went beyond Tom's role as the local mechanic. "So tell me about this contract," Tom said after they had ordered. "What exactly will Chen Logistics be doing?" Sarah explained the scope of the rural healthcare transportation project, the logistical challenges it would involve, and what it meant for the future of her company. Tom listened with the focused attention she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him, asking thoughtful questions about route planning, emergency protocols, and coordination with medical facilities. "It sounds like exactly the kind of work your grandfather would be proud of," Tom said. "Using the business he built to help people who really need it. That's what I keep thinking. He always said that transportation wasn't just about moving things from one place to another. It was about connecting people to what they needed to survive and thrive." Emma looked up from her chicken nuggets. "What did your grandfather do?" Sarah smiled at the little girl's curiosity. "He started with one truck, just like your dad has his garage. He would drive all over Montana, delivering supplies to places that were too small or too far away for the big companies to bother with. Like a superhero, but with a truck instead of a cape." "Exactly like that," Sarah laughed. "He used to say that every delivery was a chance to help someone solve a problem." Tom's expression grew thoughtful. "That's a good way to think about work. Making sure that what you do every day actually matters to people." There was something in his tone that made Sarah curious about his own story, about how he had ended up running a garage in Millerville and raising a daughter alone. But she sensed that Tom was someone who revealed his history gradually, in pieces that had to be earned through trust and time. After dinner, they walked down Main Street in the gathering dusk while Emma ran ahead, pointing out landmarks and telling Sarah about the town's history as filtered through the perspective of a 6-year-old. The post office where her dad mailed important papers. The general store where she bought penny candy with her allowance. The park where the summer concerts happened and where she had learned to ride her bike. "It's a good place to raise a child," Tom said, watching Emma demonstrate her ability to walk on the low stone wall that bordered the park. "Safe, quiet, everyone knows everyone. Sometimes I wonder if she'll feel trapped here when she gets older, but for now it's perfect." "You're not from here originally?" Tom shook his head. "Army brat, then Army myself. I lived all over before I settled here. Karen, my wife, she grew up about 50 miles north of here. This was her idea of the perfect place to build a life." It was the first time Tom had volunteered information about his wife, and Sarah felt honored by the confidence, even as she sensed the careful way he spoke about someone who was no longer there. "She had good instincts," Sarah said. "Emma seems completely at home here." "She is. Sometimes I think she's more connected to this place than I am." Karen had that gift for putting down roots, for making anywhere feel like home. Tom was quiet for a moment, watching his daughter. "I'm still learning how to do that." They had reached Tom's truck in the cafe parking lot, and Sarah realized the evening was coming to an end. She wasn't ready for it to be over, wasn't ready to drive back to Billings and return to the professional distance that had defined most of her adult relationships. "Would you like to see the shop?" Tom asked, as if he had read her thoughts. "I mean, the real tour this time. Emma loves showing people the classic cars I'm working on." Tom's garage after hours was a different place than it had been during her first visit. The overhead lights cast everything in warm pools of illumination, and the vehicles waiting for repair looked less like problems to be solved and more like stories waiting to be told. Emma immediately ran to a covered vehicle in the corner and began tugging at the tarp. "This is Dad's secret project," she announced. "He's been working on it for 2 years." Tom looked slightly embarrassed as he helped Emma pull the cover away, revealing a 1969 Mustang Mach-1 in various stages of restoration. The body had been stripped to bare metal and primed. The engine was partially rebuilt on a stand nearby, and every component showed evidence of meticulous attention to detail. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, running her hand along the smooth curve of the fender. "Is this for a customer?" For me, actually, Tom admitted. I bought it as a wreck 3 years ago. Figured I'd restore it in my spare time. It was Karen's favorite car, the one she always said she wanted when we could afford it. Sarah understood immediately. This wasn't just a restoration project. It was a connection to someone he had lost, a way of keeping a promise that had been interrupted by tragedy. She would love seeing what you're doing with it. I hope so. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just being stubborn, spending time and money on something impractical when I should be focused on more sensible things. There's nothing sensible about love, Sarah said quietly, or about honoring the people who matter to us. Tom looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to understand so quickly what the Mustang represented. Emma thinks I should paint it purple with pink stripes. That would definitely be memorable, Sarah laughed. What color was Karen planning? Candy apple red with white racing stripes. Classic muscle car colors. Tom's smile carried both fondness and sadness. She had very specific ideas about how things should look. Emma had wandered over to examine a vintage Chevrolet pickup that was clearly Tom's next project. Dad, can Sarah help you work on the cars? Tom and Sarah exchanged glances, both aware that Emma's question carried implications beyond mechanical assistance. I don't know anything about engine repair, Sarah said carefully. You could learn, Emma replied with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient determination. Dad's a good teacher. I'm sure he is, Sarah said, looking at Tom. But he probably has more experienced help available. Actually, I don't, Tom admitted. Most of the restoration work I do alone, after hours. It's more relaxing that way. Therapeutic almost. There was something in his voice that suggested the therapeutic value of the work went beyond simple stress relief. Sarah suspected that the quiet hours spent bringing old vehicles back to life served as a kind of meditation for him, a way of processing grief and rebuilding confidence in his ability to fix things that mattered. I'd like to learn, Sarah heard herself saying. If you wouldn't mind having a student who knows more about logistics than mechanics. Tom's smile was the first completely unguarded expression she had seen from him. I think I'd enjoy that. Fair warning though, Emma will expect to supervise any project we work on together. I'm an excellent supervisor, Emma announced seriously. I know where all Dad's tools are supposed to go, and I'm very good at holding flashlights. As they walked back outside, Sarah felt a sense of possibility that had nothing to do with business contracts or professional success. The evening air was cool and sweet with the scent of hay from nearby fields, and the stars were beginning to appear in the clear Montana sky. This was a world away from the competitive pressures of the transportation industry, from the constant worry about quarterly earnings and market share that had consumed most of her adult life. Thank you for dinner, Tom said as they reached Sarah's truck, and congratulations again on the contract. Your grandfather would be proud. Thank you for being the reason I was able to get there, Sarah replied, and for letting me into your world, even a little bit. Emma hugged Sarah goodnight with the easy affection of a child who had decided that someone was worthy of inclusion in her inner circle. When are you coming back? Sarah looked at Tom, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Soon, she promised. Maybe next weekend, if your dad doesn't mind having an amateur mechanic in his shop. The drive back to Billings gave Sarah time to think about what was happening between her and Tom Mitchell. It was more than gratitude for his help with the truck, more than simple attraction to a man who combined competence with kindness. There was something about the way he moved through the world, the way he balanced responsibility with gentleness, that appealed to her on a level she hadn't experienced before. Sarah had dated plenty of men over the years, but most of them had been from her professional world, ambitious and driven in ways that mirrored her own intensity. Tom was different. He was no less committed to his work, no less dedicated to the people who depended on him, but he carried that commitment with a quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself to anyone. And then there was Emma, bright and confident and completely secure in her father's love. Sarah had never thought seriously about children, had assumed that her dedication to Chen Logistics left no room for the kind of family relationships that required constant attention and compromise. But watching Tom with his daughter, seeing the easy way they communicated and the obvious joy they took in each other's company, made her wonder if she had been too quick to dismiss possibilities that might have enriched her life. The next morning brought Sarah back to the reality of implementing the contract that would transform Chen Logistics from a struggling family business into a major player in regional transportation. There were staffing decisions to make, equipment to purchase, protocols to establish, and relationships to build with dozens of healthcare facilities across Montana. The work was exactly what she had trained for her entire professional life. But for the first time, she found herself looking forward to weekend breaks from the intensity. The following Saturday, Sarah drove to Millerville with a toolbox she had borrowed from the Chen Logistics maintenance shop and a determination to learn something practical with her hands. Tom and Emma were waiting for her in the garage, where the Mustang had been rolled out into the center bay and positioned under the best lighting. "Today we're going to start with basic engine components," Tom announced, handing Sarah a pair of work gloves. "Emma will be our safety supervisor and tool coordinator." "That's a very important job," Sarah told Emma seriously. "I know," Emma replied. "Dad says the most important thing in any project is making sure everyone stays safe and has the right tools." For the next 3 hours, Tom guided Sarah through the fundamentals of engine restoration with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed teaching. He showed her how to identify different components, how to assess wear and damage, how to clean and prepare parts for reassembly. His hands covered hers as he demonstrated proper wrench technique, and Sarah found herself more aware of his touch than of the mechanical lesson. Emma proved to be an excellent supervisor, anticipating what tools would be needed next and providing a running commentary on proper garage safety protocols. It was clear that she had been absorbing knowledge about automotive repair since she was old enough to walk, and her easy familiarity with the work reminded Sarah that this garage was home in a way that went beyond simple residence. "You're a natural at this," Tom said as Sarah successfully removed a stubborn bolt that had been resisting his efforts. "Good hands, good instincts about how much pressure to apply." "I think it's similar to problem solving in logistics," Sarah replied. "You have to understand how all the pieces fit together before you can fix what's wrong." "Exactly. And you have to be patient with the process, not try to force things that aren't ready to move." There was something in the way Tom said this that made Sarah suspect he was talking about more than automotive repair. They worked together easily, falling into a rhythm that felt natural despite the fact that they barely knew each other. Tom's quiet competence created a space where Sarah felt free to ask questions, to make mistakes, to learn at her own pace without judgment. When Emma announced that she was hungry for lunch, they cleaned up and walked to Betty's place again. This time with grease under Sarah's fingernails and the satisfaction of having accomplished something concrete and visible. The other diners greeted Tom and Emma like family, and several people made a point of welcoming Sarah as if her presence with them automatically made her part of the community. "Word travels fast in small towns," Tom explained as they settled into their booth. "By tonight, everyone in Millerville will know that the woman who owns the transportation company is learning to work on cars." "Is that a problem?" Sarah asked. "Not at all. People here respect anyone who's willing to learn practical skills, and they're curious about anyone who chooses to spend time with the Mitchell family." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "And what conclusions are they drawing?" Tom smiled, but there was something careful in his expression. "That you're someone worth getting to know. Beyond that, they'll wait and see how things develop." The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that felt both natural and transformative for Sarah. Monday through Friday, She threw herself into the demanding work of implementing the healthcare transportation contract, hiring new drivers, establishing relationships with medical facilities, and fine-tuning the logistics systems that would ensure reliable service across hundreds of miles of challenging terrain. But Saturday afternoons belonged to Millerville, to the quiet garage where she was learning to restore a 1969 Mustang under the patient guidance of a man who was teaching her more than just mechanical skills. Tom never pushed, never assumed that their growing friendship meant anything beyond shared interest in the restoration project. But Sarah was aware of the way his eyes followed her movements, the way he found excuses to touch her hands when demonstrating techniques, the way he smiled when she successfully completed a task that had initially seemed impossible. Emma served as an enthusiastic intermediary, asking questions that adults might have been too polite to voice and making observations that cut straight to the heart of things. She wanted to know if Sarah had ever been married, if she wanted children, if she thought her dad was handsome, and whether she planned to keep coming to Millerville after the Mustang was finished. "Emma thinks you're good for me," Tom told Sarah one Saturday as they took a break from sanding body panels. Emma was inside the office, presumably doing homework but actually rearranging Tom's desk drawers according to her own organizational system. "What do you think?" Sarah asked, surprised by her own boldness. Tom was quiet for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on cleaning a wrench that was already spotless. "I think I'm rusty at this. It's been 4 years since Karen died, and I haven't. I've been focused on Emma and the business. I'm not sure I remember how to be anything other than a single father and a small-town mechanic." Sarah felt a wave of tenderness for this man who carried so much responsibility with such quiet grace. "You're much more than that, Tom. You're someone who stops to help strangers, who teaches 6-year-olds about safety and responsibility, who honors his wife's memory by building something beautiful with his hands. And you're someone who drives 20 miles out of her way to learn skills she doesn't need, who celebrates other people's successes as if they were her own, who sees value in things that other people might consider outdated or impractical." They were standing close enough that Sarah could see the flecks of gold in Tom's brown eyes, could smell the clean scent of soap and motor oil that seemed to define him. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and uncertainty. "Dad, Sarah, come see what I found." Emma's voice from inside the office broke the spell, but not before Sarah saw something shift in Tom's expression, a decision being made or a wall being lowered. Inside the office, Emma had discovered a photo album that had apparently been buried beneath years of business paperwork. The pictures showed Tom's restoration projects over the years, before and after shots that documented his ability to bring seemingly hopeless vehicles back to life. "This is the first car Dad ever fixed," Emma announced, pointing to a photograph of a severely damaged Chevrolet Camaro. "He said it looked like it had been hit by a tornado, but look what he did to it." Sarah studied the transformation photos, impressed by the level of craftsmanship they represented. "Tom, these are incredible. You're not just a mechanic, you're an artist." "I just like fixing things that other people have given up on," Tom said quietly. "There's something satisfying about taking something broken and making it work again." Sarah looked at him, understanding that he was talking about more than just automobiles. "Is that what you're doing with me?" The question hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that surprised them both. Tom met her eyes directly, and Sarah saw in them the recognition of someone who understood exactly what she was asking. "I think," Tom said carefully, "that maybe we're fixing each other." The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in October, just as Sarah was reviewing route schedules for the new healthcare contract. Her assistant knocked on her office door with an expression that immediately put Sarah on alert. "There's someone from Western Transport Solutions on line 2, Jennifer said. "He says it's urgent regarding the state transportation contract." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Western Transport had been one of the losing bidders for the healthcare contract, the subsidiary of the Denver-based Logistics Corporation that had underbid everyone else. She couldn't imagine why they would be calling her now, unless there was some kind of problem with the contract award. Sarah Chen speaking. Ms. Chen, this is Marcus Webb, Director of Operations for Western Transport Solutions. I'm calling because we filed a formal protest with the Montana State Transportation Authority regarding the recent contract award. Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. On what grounds? Irregularities in the bidding process, potential conflicts of interest, and questions about your company's ability to meet the technical requirements of the contract. I wanted to give you a heads up that you'll be receiving formal notification from the state within the next few days. What kind of irregularities? Sarah demanded, but the line was already dead. Marcus Webb had delivered his message and hung up, leaving her to absorb the implications alone. Sarah immediately called Chairman Hastings' office, but Margaret Kowalski could only confirm that a protest had been filed and that all contract implementation would be suspended pending a formal review. The investigation could take weeks or even months, and during that time, Chen Logistics would receive no payments while still being expected to maintain readiness to begin service. The financial implications were devastating. Sarah had already hired 12 new drivers, leased additional vehicles, and invested heavily in the technology systems required to coordinate with medical facilities across the state. The contract payments were supposed to begin covering those expenses within 30 days. Without that revenue stream, Chen Logistics would be in serious trouble within 6 weeks. That evening, Sarah found herself driving toward Millerville without having consciously made the decision to go there. The October sky was darkening early, and the mountains were dusted with the first snow of the season. She needed to think, needed to figure out how to respond to this crisis. But somehow her truck had carried her away from Billings and toward the small town where a mechanic and his daughter had become the bright spot in her increasingly complicated life. Tom's garage was still open when she arrived, light spilling from the service bays onto the gravel parking area. She could see him working under the hood of a pickup truck, his movements efficient and sure as he diagnosed whatever problem had brought the vehicle to his shop. For a moment, Sarah sat in her truck and watched him work, finding something calming about his quiet competence in the face of mechanical challenges. Sarah? Tom emerged from behind the truck, wiping his hands on a shop rag. I wasn't expecting you tonight. Everything okay? One look at her face told him that everything was definitely not okay. Tom immediately set down his tools and walked over to her truck, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. Can we talk? Sarah asked, her voice tighter than she intended. Of course, let me just lock up here. Tom quickly secured the shop and led her to the small office area where Emma's homework materials were scattered across a corner desk. Emma's at her friend Katie's house for dinner, so we have some privacy. What's wrong? Sarah explained about the protest, about the suspension of the contract, about the financial crisis that was about to engulf Chen Logistics. Tom listened without interrupting, his brown eyes never leaving her face as she outlined the scope of the problem. So basically, Sarah concluded, Western Transport is trying to steal the contract by claiming we're not qualified to fulfill it. They're hoping the review process will take so long that we'll go bankrupt before it's resolved. That's a hell of a strategy, Tom said grimly. Can they actually make those charges stick? I don't know. Our technical proposal was solid, our safety record is perfect, and we have all the required certifications. But Western Transport has corporate lawyers and unlimited resources to drag this out. They can afford to wait. We can't. Tom was quiet for a moment, processing what she had told him. What do you need to survive the review period? A miracle, Sarah said bitterly. Or about $200,000 to cover payroll and equipment leases while we wait for the bureaucrats to decide whether we deserve the contract we already won. What about a loan? Banks, investors, something like that? Sarah shook her head. We're already leveraged to the limit. I mortgaged everything to fund the expansion for this contract. No bank is going to lend money to a transportation company that's facing a legal challenge to its biggest source of revenue. Tom leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. There might be another option, such as fight back. If Western Transport is making false claims about your qualifications, expose them. Show the review board exactly why Chen Logistics is the right choice for this contract. Sarah felt a surge of frustration. Tom, I already did that. I gave the presentation of my life to win this contract in the first place. What more can I possibly show them? Not what you can show them, Tom said quietly. What you can prove to them. In real time, under real conditions. Sarah stared at him. What do you mean? Tom stood up and walked to the window that looked out over Main Street. Winter's coming early this year. The Weather Service is predicting a major storm system to hit the region in the next week or two. When that happens, every transportation company in Montana is going to be tested. And that's when you demonstrate that Chen Logistics can do things that Western Transport can't. Real emergency logistics, real problem solving under pressure, real service to communities that need help. Sarah felt a spark of something that might have been hope. You're talking about proving our capabilities in the field instead of just on paper. Exactly. Western Transport can file all the protests they want, but if Chen Logistics is the company that gets medical supplies through when the roads are impassable and the big corporations have given up, that's going to be pretty hard to argue with. But we're not supposed to start service until the contract is finalized. Tom smiled, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something that reminded her why she had been drawn to this man in the first place. Who says anything about the contract? I'm talking about doing what your grandfather would have done. Helping people who need help, regardless of whether there's a piece of paper that says you're supposed to. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand what Tom was suggesting. Volunteer emergency transportation services. During the first major storm of the season, when the regular systems are overwhelmed and people are going to be in real danger without reliable logistics support. That's incredibly risky, Sarah said. If something goes wrong, if we can't deliver what we promise, it could destroy our reputation permanently. And if you don't take the risk, Tom pointed out, Western Transport is going to destroy your company anyway. At least this way you go down fighting. Sarah stood up and began pacing the small office, her mind racing through the implications of what Tom was proposing. It was audacious, potentially catastrophic, and exactly the kind of bold move that her grandfather might have made when Chen Logistics was just one truck and a determination to serve customers that everyone else had written off. I'd need to coordinate with emergency services, medical facilities, probably the National Guard if the storm is as bad as you're suggesting. I know people, Tom said. Emma's soccer coach is married to the county emergency coordinator. My Army buddy Jake runs logistics for the State National Guard unit based in Great Falls. If you're serious about this, I can make some calls. Sarah stopped pacing and looked at Tom directly. Why would you do that? This isn't your problem, and if we fail, it's not going to affect your life in Millerville. Tom's expression grew serious. Because I believe in what you're trying to build. Because I think your grandfather was right about transportation being more than just moving things from one place to another. And because I care about what happens to you. The last sentence hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went far beyond professional support or friendly concern. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized they were moving into territory that neither of them had explicitly acknowledged before. Tom, I know we haven't talked about what's happening between us, Tom said quietly. I know I'm probably the last person you expected to get involved with when you drove out here with a broken down truck. But Sarah, these past few weeks, watching you work on the Mustang, seeing how you are with Emma, getting to know the person behind the business suit, it's been complicated, Sarah finished. Wonderful, Tom corrected. And I don't want to lose that because some corporate lawyers think they can bully you out of a contract you earned. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. The stress of the day, combined with Tom's unexpected declaration, was threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained professional composure. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "The emergency response plan, fighting Western transport, figuring out what's happening between us. It's too much." Tom crossed the room and took her hands in his, the calloused warmth of his fingers, grounding her in the moment. "You don't have to do it alone. That's what I'm trying to tell you. But if we fail, if Chen Logistics goes under, I'll have to leave Montana. I'll lose everything my grandfather built, and I'll lose—" "You'll lose what?" Sarah looked into Tom's eyes and saw reflected there the same vulnerability she was feeling. "I'll lose you. And Emma. And this place that's starting to feel like home." Tom's smile was gentle and sure. "Then we better make sure we don't fail." The next morning, Sarah woke up with a clarity of purpose she hadn't felt since the day she first learned about the contract protest. Tom had been right about one thing. She couldn't save Chen Logistics by playing it safe and hoping the bureaucratic process would work in her favor. If Western Transport wanted a fight, she would give them one on terms that played to her company's strengths. Sarah spent the morning making phone calls to every contact she had built over 15 years in the transportation industry. Emergency coordinators, hospital administrators, National Guard logistics officers, even volunteer fire departments in remote counties that might need supply deliveries during severe weather. By noon, she had assembled an informal network of agencies willing to coordinate with Chen Logistics during emergency conditions. The breakthrough came when she reached Colonel Sarah Martinez, who oversaw emergency transportation for the Montana National Guard. Colonel Martinez remembered Chen Logistics from several previous emergency responses and was immediately interested in Tom's idea. "We've been looking for a civilian contractor who could handle specialized medical deliveries during severe weather events," Colonel Martinez explained. "The big companies always promise they can do it, but when push comes to shove, they don't have the local knowledge or the flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. What would you need from us? Proof that you can deliver critical supplies to remote locations under adverse conditions. If you can demonstrate that capability during the next major storm, it would go a long way toward supporting your position in any contract review." Sarah felt the pieces of Tom's plan clicking into place. "And if we can't? Then Western Transport's argument that you're not qualified starts to look a lot more credible." That afternoon, Sarah drove back to Millerville with a trunk full of weather monitoring equipment and emergency communication devices that Colonel Martinez had arranged for her to borrow from the National Guard. The Weather Service was now predicting that the season's first major storm would hit the region within 48 hours, bringing heavy snow, high winds, and the kind of dangerous travel conditions that would test every transportation system in the state. Tom was waiting for her at the garage, along with Emma and a man Sarah didn't recognize. The stranger was tall and lean with the bearing of someone who had spent years in the military, and his handshake was firm and direct. "Sarah, this is Jake Morrison, the guy I told you about who works logistics for the National Guard. He drove down from Great Falls to meet you." Jake's assessment of Sarah was frank and professional. "Tom tells me you're planning to run emergency medical deliveries during the storm as a way to demonstrate your company's capabilities. That's the idea. Assuming we can coordinate with the appropriate agencies and ensure we're not interfering with official emergency response efforts." "You won't be interfering," Jake said. "You'll be filling gaps that the official response can't cover. But I have to ask, are you prepared for what you're volunteering for? We're talking about driving in whiteout conditions, navigating roads that might be impassable, delivering supplies that could mean the difference between life and death for people in remote areas." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. "I understand the risks," do you? Because if your drivers get stranded or injured trying to make these deliveries, it's not just your business reputation that's on the line. It's people's lives, including the lives of anyone who might have to come rescue you. Tom stepped forward. Jake, she knows what she's getting into, and she's not doing this alone. Jake looked between Tom and Sarah with the shrewd assessment of someone who was reading more into the situation than what was being explicitly stated. You planning to ride along on these deliveries, Tom? If Sarah will have me. I know these roads better than most people, and I've driven in conditions that would stop most civilian drivers. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude mixed with concern. Tom, I can't ask you to risk your life for my business problems. What about Emma? Emma will be staying with her friend Katie's family until the storm passes, Tom said firmly. This is important, Sarah, not just for Chen Logistics, but for the people who are going to need help when the weather turns bad. Jake nodded approvingly. That's the right attitude. But you'll need more than good intentions to pull this off. You'll need vehicles equipped for extreme weather, communication equipment that works when cell towers are down, and drivers who know how to handle emergency conditions. Chen Logistics has four-wheel drive trucks with snow tires and emergency equipment, Sarah said. And our drivers have all completed defensive driving and emergency response training. What about navigation? GPS systems don't work reliably in heavy snow, and road conditions can change faster than any mapping system can track. Tom smiled. That's where local knowledge comes in. I've been driving these roads for 8 years, and I know every back route, every alternate path, every place where you can get stuck, and every place where you can get through. Emma had been listening to the adult conversation with the intense focus of a child trying to understand something important. Dad, are you and Sarah going to be heroes? Tom knelt down to Emma's level, his expression serious but gentle. We're going to try to help people who need help. That's what heroes do, right? Emma nodded solemnly. Mom would be proud of you. The comment hit Tom like a physical blow, and Sarah saw him struggle to maintain his composure. I hope so, sweetheart. Jake cleared his throat. If you're serious about this, we need to start planning now. The storm is going to hit Thursday night, and by Friday morning, half the roads in central Montana are going to be impassable. The next 36 hours passed in a blur of preparation that reminded Sarah why she had been drawn to the logistics business in the first place. There was something deeply satisfying about coordinating complex operations, about identifying problems before they became crises, about building systems that could function under pressure. Working with Jake and Tom, Sarah developed a comprehensive emergency response plan that would position Chen Logistics vehicles at strategic locations across a 3-county area. Each truck would be equipped with medical supplies, emergency food, and water, communication equipment, and the tools necessary to navigate treacherous road conditions. The plan was ambitious almost to the point of recklessness. Chen Logistics would attempt to maintain supply lines to 12 remote medical facilities, 3 senior care centers, and 2 isolated communities that would be cut off from normal transportation services once the storm hit. If they succeeded, it would demonstrate exactly the kind of capabilities that the State Transportation Board was looking for. If they failed, it would probably end Sarah's career in the logistics business. Wednesday evening, as the first clouds began building on the western horizon, Sarah found herself alone with Tom in his garage, while Emma spent her last night at Katie's house before the storm. They had finished loading the emergency supplies into Sarah's grandfather's Ford pickup, which would serve as their primary vehicle for the most challenging deliveries. You know this is insane, don't you? Sarah said, checking the tie-downs on their equipment for the 3rd time. Completely, Tom agreed. Your grandfather would have loved it. Sarah looked at him, this man who had somehow become central to her life in just a few short weeks. Tom, if something happens to you because of this, I'll never forgive myself. And if I let you do this alone and something happens to you, I'll never forgive myself. Tom walked over to where she stood beside the truck. Sarah, we're in this. Together now, whatever happens. Together, Sarah repeated, testing the weight of the word. Together, Tom confirmed, and then he kissed her. It was their first kiss, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as Sarah responded to the warmth and certainty she found in his touch. When they finally broke apart, Sarah felt as if something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of what was possible. I should probably mention, Tom said quietly, that I'm falling in love with you. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. I should probably mention that I'm terrified by how much I care about you. Fear is good, Tom said. It means this matters. Outside the garage, the wind was beginning to pick up, carrying the scent of snow from the mountains. The storm that would test everything they had built together was less than 12 hours away. Thursday night brought the kind of weather that made experienced Montana drivers park their vehicles and wait for better conditions. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes that reduced visibility to mere yards, while wind gusts approaching 50 miles per hour created drifts that could bury a car in minutes. By midnight, the State Highway Patrol had issued travel advisories for most of central Montana, and several major highways were already closed to all but emergency traffic. Sarah and Tom were awake before dawn Friday morning, monitoring weather reports and emergency communications from their base of operations in Tom's garage. The early reports were sobering. Highway 2 was closed between Havre and Malta. Interstate 15 was shut down north of Great Falls, and dozens of smaller roads were already impassable. This is it, Jake's voice crackled over the radio from his command post in Great Falls. We've got reports of medical emergencies in 3 different locations that normal emergency services can't reach. Are you ready to move? Sarah looked at Tom, who was already pulling on his heavy winter coat and checking the contents of their emergency kit one final time. We're ready. Their first call came from the Coteau Medical Clinic, which needed insulin for a diabetic patient whose supply had been interrupted when a pharmacy delivery truck got stuck in a snowdrift. The clinic was 37 miles from Millerville, along roads that the highway department had already declared impassable for civilian traffic. Sarah climbed into the passenger seat of her grandfather's Ford while Tom took the wheel, his hands steady and sure as he guided the truck out of the garage and onto Main Street. Millerville looked like a ghost town, its buildings barely visible through the swirling snow, but Tom navigated the familiar streets with confidence. You sure about this? Sarah asked as they reached the edge of town and Tom turned onto a county road that looked more like a snow-covered field than a transportation route. I'm sure about us, Tom replied. The road conditions are negotiable. For the next hour, Sarah gained a new appreciation for Tom's driving skills and for the capabilities of her grandfather's old truck. Tom seemed to know instinctively where the pavement lay beneath the snow, which drifts were shallow enough to push through and which ones required detours onto barely visible farm roads. The Ford's engine ran strong and steady, its 4-wheel drive system and snow tires providing the traction they needed to keep moving when other vehicles would have been hopelessly stuck. They reached the Coteau Clinic just as the morning shift was arriving, their truck the only civilian vehicle in a parking lot that normally would have been full of cars. The relief on the faces of the medical staff was evident as Sarah and Tom delivered the insulin along with additional medical supplies that Jake had suggested they include. You have no idea how important this is, Dr. Patricia Wong told them as they prepared to leave. We have 6 diabetic patients in this area who depend on regular insulin deliveries. Without it, we'd be looking at life-threatening emergencies within hours. Their second delivery took them to a senior care facility near Conrad, where 43 elderly residents needed prescription medications that should have been delivered the previous day. This time, the route required them to navigate a series of back roads that weren't marked on any official map, relying entirely on Tom's knowledge of the local geography. "How do you know about these roads?" Sarah asked as Tom guided the truck along what appeared to be a fence line between wheat fields, hunting mostly, and exploring with Emma on weekends. "When you live in a place long enough, you learn all the ways to get from here to there." "Including ways that don't officially exist," Tom smiled. "Especially those." By noon, they had completed 4 successful deliveries and were beginning to understand the rhythm of emergency transportation in severe weather. It wasn't just about driving through snow. It was about reading the landscape, about understanding how wind patterns created drifts and how terrain affected vehicle handling. It was about having backup plans for the backup plans, and about the kind of judgment that could only come from experience. Their radio crackled with a new assignment from Jake. "We've got a priority medical emergency in Grass Range. Pregnant. Woman in premature labor needs immediate transport to the hospital in Billings. Ambulance services can't get through, and the helicopter can't fly in these conditions." Sarah felt her stomach clench. Medical transport was a completely different level of responsibility than delivering supplies. They would be carrying a human life under conditions where any mistake could have catastrophic consequences. "How far is Grass Range?" she asked Tom. "About 60 miles from here. But getting to Billings from there in this weather." Tom shook his head. "That's going to be the challenge of our lives." Sarah keyed the radio. "Jake, we'll need to coordinate with the hospital. Make sure they're ready for us and have the fastest route cleared for emergency access." "Already working on it." "But Sarah, you need to understand what you're volunteering for. If that woman or her baby doesn't make it, if something goes wrong during transport, the consequences go way beyond your business problems." Sarah looked at Tom, who nodded grimly. "We understand. We're moving." The drive to Grass Range tested every skill Tom had developed during 8 years of Montana winters. They encountered drifts that required detours of several mile sections, of road where the pavement was completely invisible beneath packed snow, and wind conditions that threatened to push the truck off course despite its weight and stability. But they reached the small ranch house where Jennifer Martinez was in active labor, her contractions coming every 2 minutes while her husband paced frantically around their living room. The local volunteer Imt had been trying to get through for over an hour, but his vehicle was stuck 3 miles away. "Thank God you're here," Roberto Martinez said as Sarah and Tom carried their emergency medical kit into the house. "Jennifer's been in labor for 6 hours, and something's wrong. The baby's coming too early." Sarah had taken emergency medical training as part of her transportation certification, but she had never imagined using it under these circumstances. Working with the intend who had reached the house on foot, she helped prepare Jennifer for transport, while Tom got the truck ready for what would be a 90-mile emergency run to Billings. "The roads between here and Billings are completely shut down," Roberto said as they carefully helped Jennifer into the back seat of the Ford. "Highway Patrol isn't letting anyone through. Highway Patrol isn't expecting anyone with a good reason to be out here," Tom replied. "Hold on tight. This is going to be the ride of your lives." The trip to Billings took 3 hours that felt like 3 days. Tom drove with a concentration and skill that Sarah had never witnessed before, navigating roads that were barely passable while maintaining enough speed to get Jennifer to the hospital before her baby decided to arrive in the back seat of a pickup truck. Sarah spent the journey monitoring Jennifer's condition, timing contractions, and coordinating with the hospital staff via radio to ensure they would be ready for an immediate emergency delivery. Twice they had to stop while Tom cleared snow from the truck's air intake, and once they had to backtrack 5 miles when they encountered a drift that was too deep to navigate. But they made it. Jennifer Martinez gave birth to a healthy baby boy in the Billings Hospital's emergency room, 47 minutes after Tom's Ford pulled into the ambulance bay. The delivery was successful, the baby was strong, and Sarah found herself crying with relief in the hospital parking lot, while Tom held her against his chest. "We did it," she whispered against his jacket. "We actually did it." "You did it," Tom corrected. "You made the decision to try. You coordinated with the medical teams. You kept that woman calm and stable during the worst drive of my life." "We did it together," Sarah said firmly. "Just like you promised." The storm continued for another 18 hours, during which Sarah and Tom completed 6 more emergency deliveries and rescued 2 stranded motorists whose vehicles had broken down in remote areas. By Sunday morning, when the snow finally stopped and the highway crews began clearing the major roads, Chen Logistics had become a legend among Montana's emergency services personnel. The phone calls started before Sarah had even made it back to Billings. Colonel Martinez wanted to discuss a formal partnership with the National Guard. Dr. Wong from the Quito Clinic wanted to arrange regular supply deliveries. Most importantly, Chairman Hastings from the State Transportation Board wanted to schedule an immediate meeting to discuss the contract protest. "Ms. Chen," Hastings said when Sarah returned his call Sunday afternoon, "I've been receiving reports all weekend about Chen Logistics' performance during the storm. Extraordinary reports. We were just doing what needed to be done." "No, you were doing what the other companies claimed they could do, but never actually proved they could deliver. Western Transport's protest is starting to look pretty ridiculous. When we have documented evidence of your company successfully completing emergency medical deliveries under conditions that shut down every other transportation system in the state." Sarah felt hope rising in her chest for the first time since the protest had been filed. "Does that mean the contract review will be expedited?" "It means the review is over. The board is meeting tomorrow morning to formally reject Western Transport's protest and confirm Chen Logistics as the contractor for rural healthcare transportation." "Congratulations, Miss Chen. You've earned this." That evening, Sarah sat in Tom's garage while Emma regaled them with stories from her weekend with Katie's family, completely unaware that her father and Sarah had spent the past 3 days risking their lives to save a transportation company and deliver a baby. The normalcy of Emma's chatter, the warmth of Tom's hand in hers, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that Chen Logistics was secure, all combined to create a sense of peace that Sarah had never experienced before. "So what happens now?" Tom asked after Emma had gone to bed. "Now we implement the contract properly. Build the business my grandfather would have been proud of. Make sure we can deliver the kind of service that people actually need." "And what about us?" Sarah smiled, thinking about everything they had accomplished together, everything they had discovered about each other during 3 days that had tested every aspect of their characters. "I think," she said carefully, "that we've proven we work pretty well as a team." Tom's smile was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "I was hoping you'd say that." Outside the garage, the stars were beginning to appear in the clear post-storm sky, bright and sharp in the cold Montana night. Sarah thought about the baby who had been born because 2 strangers had been willing to drive through impossible conditions, about the patients who had received their medications because someone had cared enough to take extraordinary risks, about the business that had been saved because a mechanic had believed in the value of fighting for things that mattered. "Tom? Yeah, I love you too." The words felt natural and right, as solid and dependable as her grandfather's truck, as true as the steady rhythm of an engine that had been built to last. Outside, the world was vast and challenging and full of roads that led to destinations she couldn't yet imagine. But inside the garage, surrounded by the tools and photographs and quiet evidence of Tom's life, Sarah had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for: home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.